Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 273, Bully Hayes, Part 2. In the first part, we've just finished off with him taking sail and evading San Francisco and heading out of the bay. Hayes did sail back across the Pacific. The captain pretended he was about to sail for Melbourne. He actually abandoned Amelia in San Francisco, and on September the 15th, 1859, the Alanita arrived at Kahului on the island of Maui at Sandwich Islands, and 3 days after, Hayes was arrested by Sheriff Treadway on a charge of smuggling. The sheriff was called as he entered through customs with no papers. Hayes initially apologised profusely and stated that his mate had informed him the port required $170 of formal entry. If, however, he'd been misinformed, he would be delighted to comply with the requirements now. However, the sheriff indicated there was a jail at Lahaina across the island, and the captain went along gladly, saying, "Of course, we must comply with the law." And at first, would the sheriff accompany him on board while he gave instructions to his mate to bring the boat around? So the sheriff acquiesced, not intending to let his prisoner give him the slip. Once on board, Hayes set about to make things so agreeable that the sheriff accepted the invitation to dine in the pretty cabin. With dinner finished, a bottle of rare old wine and a cigar, which was seldom seen on Maui, and a fascinating story from the captain whiled away the hours until dark, he went under the spell of a congenial atmosphere, and the sheriff actually accepted a bunk and stretched himself off to sleep. When Treadway rubbed the wine out of his eyes in the morning, the Alanita was already coming around in a fair breeze. Hayes enjoyed the situation and claimed that the officer helped him work the brig out of the harbour, and before the sheriff was suspicious, it gave the captain time to inform him that they were setting their course for Australia and he may as well come along as the boat's guest, or he'll need to hop over the side and return to his own boat. What the feelings of Treadway were as he stood upon the beach and watched the Alanita hull down on the horizon, we can only surmise. Hayes wrote a letter to the newspaper in Sydney and said that he uttered the words, "Goodbye, Sheriff. How little your employers dream of the good old soul that lies concealed under your parchment covering." And the newspaper also mentions that with the characteristic poor memory, Captain Hayes forgot to pay for the provisions that he'd taken aboard at Kahului. After leaving the Hawaiian Islands, rough weather was encountered which opened seams and flooded part of the hold of the old craft. Progress became slow and the water supply ran low and the crew had to be placed on half rations. Then the food supply gave out, necessitating rations for all. The brig leaked worse and worse and the pumps had to be manned in shifts throughout the day, much to the discomfort of the miserable crew suffering from a lack of food and water. The ship's chronometer failed and they were off their course. They did not know where they were most of the time. In this sorry state, the water in the hold started to rise faster than the pumps could handle it. Thinking they were in the vicinity of Savai, the largest island of Samoa, the captain set his course for that place. Soon, however, the old ship began to settle in the water and the raft was hastily made on deck and provisioned. The crew and the men passengers were placed aboard this raft and towed clear of the foundering vessel. The captain, with a couple of men to row, now loaded all of the women and children in the only boat and got away just as the Alanita disappeared below the water. Hayes's feat in navigating this small boat to survive for help while the raft with 15 men aboard drifted helplessly for 20 days before bringing up at Wallis Island brought him praise but also blame. The indescribable sufferings of those on the raft without food or water, except the occasional showers and fish they caught, form an epic of suffering in South Sea shipwreck tales. They were finally landed more dead than alive on Wallis and cared for by the natives and the good missionaries of that place who nursed them back to life. Hayes, his mate, 1 seaman and 9 passengers landed on Savai, Samoa on the 20th of October and ultimately reached Apia. The raft that arrived on Wallis Island did result in the loss of 1 man's life. At Samoa, Hayes became acquainted with Captain Abner West Kempton, an American whose brig the Marian had been wrecked at Apia, from which he borrowed £53, promising to make Kempton master of a ship, which he told Kempton was his and was lying at Port Adelaide. On New Year's Day 1860, the British war brig Elk and the brig Antonio arrived at Sydney, the Elk from Fiji bringing the crew of the raft, and the Antonio from Samoa bringing Captain Hayes, Kempton, and the passengers and crew of the Alanita. On the 6th of January 1860, the Sydney Morning Herald published The Story of a Scoundrel, being a scathing account of Hayes' career reprinted from the Honolulu Advertiser of September the 24th, 1859. In this Sydney Morning Herald article, it said that Hayes was charged with the indecent assault of Cornelia Murray on board the Alanita. The girl was only 15 years old and was assaulted soon after San Francisco. However, there was no corroboration and the case was dismissed. In the Sydney Empire, Sir Henry Parkes's paper, they also published the article, and it says, "For the information of our readers in Sydney and New South Wales generally, we have the satisfaction of informing and warning that there is now, or was a day or two since, in this colony, one of the most systematic and unmitigated scoundrels that has ever had the fortune to be possessed of. He's Captain Hayes, or Captain William Henry Hayes. He's 32, 6 foot high, 15 stone, with a rather plausible bluff exterior, with which many, it would seem, has enabled him to pass off as a very honest, jolly seaman, and he is a man who at times spends his money, or the money in his possession, very liberally, which, considering the very strong probabilities connected with its acquisition, is not very difficult to account for. The success of this enormous mercantile humbug, he having possessed himself probably to the amount of £20,000, or to the value thereof, if not twice as much in the last 8 years, without any equivalent of impudence and promises, is the more singular from the fact that he is a man of the most meagre education, possesses no particular qualities except a rare cunning, attended by an unlimited command of impudence, and a somewhat more than average degree of physical power, of which fact he is partial to give discourteous imitations to the unfavourably disposed. Whether this gentleman, who seems as yet with impunity to have committed more scoundrelism than the aggregate of crime which in former days has sent many 100 men to the gallows, will renew his performances in Sydney by way of relieving us of a ship as a rover, or will kindly vary the entertainment with another wife, or will try his hand at a gold escort, is a matter of conjecture. For of course now he has a soul above horse-stealing and such petty-fogging transactions. But it is more probable he will confine himself for a time to his favourite peculiarity, that is, an extended system of credit. Should any further noteworthy action of Mr. Hayes come within our knowledge, and it cannot for a moment be supposed that a gentleman of his talents would allow him to lie idle, we promise our readers the earliest and latest intelligence." On the 12th of January 1860, in the Sydney Morning Herald, there appeared a long letter purporting to be written by Hayes, but quite likely he was not capable of writing, headed "The Story of a Scoundrel Continued." In this, all charges against Hayes are denied, except that of befooling the sheriff at the Sandwich Islands. 4 letters also appeared in the same issue of the Herald in Hayes's favour. One was from a lady friend of Hayes who was a passenger on the Alanita. Another was from B.T. Baker, who came to Australia on the C.W. Bradley with Hayes. Another from H.E. Nields, who said he knew Hayes in Melbourne and knew his shipping business. And one from C.W. Jackson, who says he knew Hayes and his brothers in Ohio, that Hayes was a master of sailing vessels and steamers, and that he was a first-class commander, a very popular man, and they'd never heard of him being married except in Adelaide, and had never heard anything against Hayes's character until he read the article in the Herald. There is no doubt that these letters were written by Parkinson, who was also known as Baker. Jackson, who claims to have known Hayes in Ohio, was there from 1849 to 1856. He says he heard of Hayes's marriage in Adelaide in 1857, and by extraordinary coincidence was in Sydney when Hayes arrived. The Herald also outlined on the 30th of January 1860 that there was a charge against Hayes in the police court of obtaining £53 from Captain Abner W. Kempton by false pretences at Samoa. The case was dismissed as there was no jurisdiction. Soon after this, Hayes was arrested for debt and lodged in Darlinghurst Prison in Sydney. On the 19th of January 1860, he petitioned as an insolvent debtor and was released. His liabilities were £173, to Kempton £53, to Charles Bunting £20 money borrowed, and to Joseph Hemming £100 money borrowed on a non-existent ship. His assets were £15 worth of nautical instruments. Hayes was never granted any certificate by the Sydney Insolvency Court. The Charles Bunting that was mentioned was a passenger with Hayes from Samoa on the brig Antonio. Hayes was said to have a tongue that would tempt a bird off a tree, and few could withstand his plausibility, but for some time Hayes did not prosper. He joined what was termed a nigger minstrel company, singing at country races and shows, and he was plying this calling at Maitland, New South Wales races in 1860. There he became acquainted with a wealthy man named Samuel Clift of West Maitland. He induced Clift to finance him to buy the bark, the Launceston, which Hayes was registered as owner and Clift as mortgagee, and Hayes being the mortgagor. This was in April 1861. So the Launceston, with Hayes as master, sailed from Newcastle with a cargo of coal for Bombay, but she had bad weather and was put into Sydney for a refit and then sailed on the 13th of April. The Launceston did not go to Bombay, she turned up at Java, and her career in Java is given a circular dated at Batavia on August the 30th, 1861, issued by various insurance officers in Batavia. The Launceston arrived with a cargo of coal, which Hayes said belonged to him and which Hayes sold, and then he chartered the Launceston to load back to Australia with sugar and coffee. The Singapore Straits Times on the 20th of August 1859 confirmed the rumours that Hayes was the notorious bully Hayes. The East India Company merchants and underwriters were afraid to finish loading the Launceston and offered to pay him the full freight if he'd cancel the charter and discharge the cargo loaded. To this Hayes agreed, but apparently did not perform his agreement and cleared out with cargo worth $100,000 and £500 received from his agents. There was a, inverted commas, a nurse on this voyage that was also classed as a second mate, and a sailor was so disgusted with Hayes that they escaped from the Launceston in Java, and the sailor declared he'd rather jump overboard than proceed with him. Examination of the papers of Hayes and the Launceston show that some of the signatures and documents were forgeries. Hayes and the Launceston then disappeared. The register of the Launceston in Sydney Customs House shows that she was sold to foreigners in Surabaya and was written off the Sydney Register in July 1862. On the 9th of September 1862, the following telegram from Sydney appeared in the Melbourne Age. The notorious Captain Hayes, with the bark Cincinnati, visited Sydney and after engaging passengers for Dunedin, New Zealand and receiving their passage money, sailed away without a single passenger. On the 24th of September 1862, in the Otago Daily Times in New Zealand, it says, with reference to a Sydney telegram in a Melbourne paper, Captain Hayes says that the Sydney passengers referred to had declined to accept the accommodation which was originally agreed that they should have on board the Cincinnati. On the 13th of September 1862, the Sydney Mail reported the sailing from Newcastle of the bark Cincinnati, hired master for Otago, with the following passengers: Captain Hayes, Mr. and Mrs. Glodsky, Mrs. Buckingham and daughter, 4 Masters Buckingham, and Mr. Dalton, Mr. Ridgway, and Mr. Conn. The itinerant vaudeville group that he travelled with in Australia included Glodsky and the Buckingham family entertainers. At one stage, Bully Hayes was their manager. He only chartered the vaudeville troupe on the Cincinnati to New Zealand and arrived in Dunedin on the 23rd of September 1862. In fact, Hayes was neither the master nor the owner of the Cincinnati, but he used it as his own personal vessel. When they arrived at Otago, the Cincinnati was stranded and it became a coal hulk. There were various stories of Hayes' doings in New Zealand after leaving the Cincinnati. With the Buckingham family and the Glodskys, he toured southern New Zealand. The Buckingham family of variety artists travelled north with him. They got some posters printed with 3 feet letters, placarded in Vicardal, and gave successful entertainments in which Bully Hayes himself took a leading part. Then in January 1863, they arrived at the Arrowtown gold diggings to perform. The Buckingham family were doing a roaring business in the Provincial Hotel in the main street, so Hayes thought he'd go out on his own. He induced men to sod a building for him, about 60 by 30 feet in size with 8-foot walls, and to put a frame roof over of saplings. While Hayes was waiting for the arrival of Calico to roof his public house, he met in the street a Californian gold digger, a 49er named Bill Barr. They entered into a conversation, and as the Calico arrived, Bill Barr and his mate were engaged to sew it. The United States Hotel was announced on a flaming sign, and the building was shortly afterwards opened with a lively Goldfields entertainment. Money came pouring in, and for once the whole of Hayes's employees were paid in full. The chief attraction of the Buckingham family, with their business at the rival house, was the handsome Miss Rosa Buckingham. She possessed an extraordinary voice in the accompaniment of a full brass band. Hayes began a relationship with Rosa Buckingham, who was a widow. Her 4 brothers were the Masters Buckingham in the vaudeville artist troupe, and they performed as the Masters Buckingham. Open hostilities began when Rosie, being the most talented member, became pregnant and went to live with Hayes as his wife. Rosie was 14 years younger than William and was 19 when they commenced their relationship. They had a daughter, Adelaide Eudora Hayes, on the 11th of July 1863 in Riverton, New Zealand. Hayes had unusually long hair. Bill Barr, who made no wish to make an enemy of Hayes, swore the rumour did not come from him, but he had been one of the players in a little game of poker in Sacramento. Bill Barr was one of the losers, and he detected something suspicious in Hayes's play. He whipped out his bowie knife and with a swift stab pinned his man's hand to the table. In the excitement that followed, some cards slipped out of Hayes's sleeve. One of the losers pleaded to string him up on the nearest tree, but the majority decided they would cut off one of his ears. When the Buckingham brothers heard of the Sacramento story, being so angered at Hayes's seduction of Rosa, they offered £5 to any barber courageous enough to cut Bully's long hair off sufficiently to establish that he had lost an ear. The challenge was accepted. His locks were cut and the loss was revealed. For some considerable time afterwards, Hayes appeared with a carefully bandaged head and threatened to put cold steel into all and sundry for the trick that had been played upon him. Despite Rosa's loss, the Buckingham brothers continued to be a star attraction and soared in popularity. It seems that their ingenious revenge had tickled the public's fancy. Determined to make the most of the incident, they conceived the idea of putting it on stage as entertainment for the patrons of their hotel. The family concocted what they described on their billboards, that side-splitting farce, The Barbarous Barber, to which they charged admission of 10 shillings. This was too much for Hayes, who tried to block the entrance to the Buckingham Hotel on the eventful night of the first show. But the crowd surged in. A local celebrity was made up as Hayes, and Julie underwent a fearful and wonderful course of barbering every night for several weeks, to a huge delight of the diggers and to the disgust of Hayes, who fumed and raged and threatened libel action. The nearby Lake Hayes is indirectly named for him. Originally called Hayes Lake after an early settler, the spelling changed to be Hayes over the years as locals came to associate the name linked with Bully Hayes. On the 10th of October 1863 in the San Francisco Saturday Morning, court proceedings. Amelia Hayes commenced a suit today to divorce her husband, William H. Hayes. She said in her complaint that they were married in Australia in 1857, that he deserted her in this city 4 years ago, and she has no knowledge of where he is now. William Hayes travelled to Australia in 1864 and purchased the brigantine Black Diamond. On the 11th of April 1864, he was registered in Sydney as the owner of the Black Diamond, and on June the 23rd, 1864, in the Newcastle Chronicle, the following appeared. Departure of the schooner Black Diamond. Hayes, master, with a cargo of 60 tonne of gold, left for Brisbane on the 19th of June 1864. On the 17th of June 1864, the following members of the crew of the schooner Black Diamond were Joseph Mitchison, Anthony Hall, William Bird, Peter Olserton, and they were charged with being absent without leave. They pled not guilty, as they said the vessel was unseaworthy. The magistrate adjourned the case for the purpose of having the ship examined, but in the meantime Hayes obtained a fresh crew, took advantage of the favourable weather, and left swiftly for Brisbane. However, Hayes did not go to Brisbane. On July the 4th, 1864, in Auckland's Southern Cross of New Zealand, it says the brigantine Black Diamond arrived in Auckland yesterday. She sailed for Nelson from Newcastle on the 19th of June, 1864, with a cargo of coal. On the 22nd of June, she encountered the cyclone previously reported, and which proved so destructive to the latter. Captain Hayes consequently kept his ship before the wind and steered for this port. The gale lasted 3 days, in which the ship lost her foretopsail, her mainsail, and her foretopmast staysail. And then in the Auckland New Zealander, the Black Diamond was originally bound to Nelson, but a disagreement occurred between the captain and the crew in Newcastle. They were taken ashore by the police office at Newcastle on the 18th of June, and as the case could not be heard till the Monday morning, the captain got away on the Sunday, again choosing a Sunday, without them, and the 3 passengers and his mate brought her to Auckland. On the 19th of June 1864, in the Southern Cross, paying with the topsail, a brigantine called the Black Diamond arrived in this port a fortnight ago with coal from Newcastle. She was under the command of Captain Hayes, and a quantity of coal he bought in the miserable-looking craft, which he succeeded in navigating over from Newcastle. The craft was very small, and the cargo not amounting to more than £100 worth. This was sold through his agent, and the balance came to him some £30 odd, and was handed over to him about the middle of last week. It is fully understood, however, by the captain's own statement that he would not sail until this day, and in the meantime his creditors expected to get their money. Some of them dunned him on Saturday, but Captain Hayes politely excused himself on the grounds that the boat race had absorbed his attention until after bank hours, but one creditor, who succeeded in getting his £10 off his bill, was assured that on Monday he'd be paid the balance. Monday came, however, and it was then found that the Black Diamond, which we are informed had previously cleared out for Nelson, whither she was originally bound, had sailed during the still hours of the night, and among those who suffered were Thwaites, Henderson and Company shipbuilders, who repaired the Black Diamond, £20, Owen and Fendelow ironmongers, £30, Nicol and Company ship chandlers, £10, Oliver and Son clothiers, £8, and a passenger by the Black Diamond for money lent, £9, as well as other amounts including the cost of water put on board. A meeting of creditors was to be held on Tuesday. There were also notes written about Bully Hayes' former connection with the Buckinghams. It says his object in bringing the Black Diamond from New South Wales was to put her in the lightering trade between Moko and Invercargill, but when her cargo was discharged, he found she drew too much water for lightering. He'd borrowed £300 in New South Wales on a bottomry bond. So, as mentioned before, it usually stipulated that if the ship was lost in the course of the voyage, then the lender shall lose the whole of his money. But if she arrives safely, the lender is then entitled to get back his principal and interest. Hayes had induced the lender to put a clause in the bond stating that the money and the interest were to be paid when the ship was leaving Invercargill. Hence, if she ended her days lightering at Invercargill, the mortgagee would have to whistle for his money. But when he found the vessel useless for lightering, Hayes was not at the end of his resources. He went through a farce of wrecking her on a sand beach in the river in perfectly smooth water. He perforated her side with an auger so water could flow in, and his next move was to find 2 masters of small craft who could be depended on to survey and condemn the boat without discovering the auger hole. The ship was then sold by public auction, but purchased by Bully Hayes through a dummy. So the proceeds of the sale, after paying the expenses, amounted to an exceedingly satisfactory sum, from Hayes's point of view, of 9 shillings and 7 pence, which amount was forthwith remitted with solemn legal familiarity to the astonished legal moneylender. He returned to New Zealand, intending to take the Buckingham family entertainers, with whom he was now reconciled, to China. On the 9th of August 1864, the Black Diamond was lying at Croxellies, being caulked, and was loading firewood when Hayes borrowed Mr. Askew's yacht with Rosa, her child, Rosa's brother, and a nursemaid. They were all drowned, as detailed in the Nelson Colonist on the 2nd of September 1864. The late fatal accident at the Croxells. Police Constable Mayo, who dispatched to the Croxells to make inquiry into this deplorable accident and to make arrangements for the search of the bodies, returned to Nelson on Wednesday night accompanied by Captain Hayes, the master and owner of the brigantine Black Diamond, whose wife, child, brother-in-law and maid servant were drowned in the sinking of Mr. Askew's yacht in a squall in the Croxells Harbour on Friday, August 19th. Mr. Mayo arrived at Croxells on Wednesday week and up to Tuesday evening was engaged in searching for the bodies of the 3 persons who'd not been found and taking official evidence regarding the painful occurrence. The names of the drowned persons are Mrs. Roma Hayes, aged 20, Adelaide Adora Hayes, aged 13 months, George Buckingham, brother to Mrs. Hayes, aged 23, and Mary Cowley, the maid servant, aged 15. The body of the child was found on the beach near the Boulder Banks and was disinterred on Sunday in the presence of a number of witnesses. It had scarcely begun to decompose, and with the exception of a slightest graze on the temple, quite a skin wound, there was no mark on the body. When the boat sank, which she did instantly, the captain seized the infant with one hand and his wife in the other, while his brother-in-law struck out for one of the islands. Captain Hayes called to him to take the baby, but he apparently did not hear, and by and by first one oar and then another floated in the direction of the 3 and enabled Captain Hayes to keep up his burden longer than he otherwise could have done. The place he landed at was very rugged, and he must, while in a state of mental insensibility, have climbed over a rugged point on the coast which intervened between the spot at which he landed and that where the ship was lying. Under the police officer's management, dragging was carried on around the spot where the yacht sank, and a diligent search was made for days all around the harbour, but without success. None of the bodies had been found. The yacht herself was raised by the crew of the Black Diamond on Monday, and on it was found the coat of George Buckingham. The hat of the maid and the cap of Buckingham were found about the same time as the body of the child was discovered. Before leaving on Wednesday morning, Captain Hayes left orders to continue to search the shores of the harbour and send to Nelson immediately if any of the bodies should be found. But we fear after this lapse of time that there's little likelihood of their being found, late the gale and the upsetting of our boat on the Croxells. Then there was a letter to the editor of The Colonist. Dear Sir, I should feel obliged if you could insert a letter of thanks from me to the settlers of the Croxells, who assisted me in a most kind and hospitable manner after the unhappy and most lamentable loss of my wife, child, brother and servant during the late gale and the upsetting of our boat at the Croxells. The names of those I feel especially grateful to are Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Rankin and Mr. McLaurin, to whom I feel forever grateful for their kind assistance rendered upon this occasion. I am yours, etc. W. H. Hayes, Master of the Black Diamond, Nelson, 1st of September 1864. The Black Diamond remained at the Croxells Harbour for 3 or 4 weeks after the drownings and was then brought to Nelson. In the Nelson Colonist, it has an article titled Seizure of the Black Diamond. The brigantine Black Diamond is a vessel not unknown to fame in these colonies any more than her unfortunate ex-Captain Hayes. She is now lying in the Nelson Harbour for sale, but the way she was brought here has a spice of romance in it which will make the narrative interesting. The brigantine was mortgaged to a person in Sydney who, being unable to realise or obtain interest, resolved to foreclose as soon as he or his agents could get a chance of laying hands on the ship. Instructions to that effect accordingly were sent from Sydney to N. Edwards & Co. of Nelson. It was known that the Black Diamond was lying in some part of the Croxells Harbour, loading firewood, and to get there, armed with legal authority for her seizure under the powers of the mortgagee, before it was possible for her to leave the colony, was the object to be accomplished. Mr. W. Akerstein of Nelson undertook the task, which was deemed one of some difficulty and might be of some risk. He selected a whaleboat's crew of 6 stout fellows, most of whom were sworn in as special constables. The boat was towed by the Littleton steamer down to the Croxells, which was reached in the evening, but no sign of the Black Diamond was visible. The crew pulled about the harbour and into various nooks for about 6 hours, and at last at 3 o'clock in the morning came on the brigantine, lying calmly at anchor near the very top of the harbour in a sheltered spot pretty well excluded from outward observation. Cautiously the boat was approached, and as cautiously but quickly boarded by Mr. Akerstein and his men, all hands being below in their berths. The captain first made his appearance on deck, inquiring in brief but emphatic language to what he was indebted for the honour of such an early morning call. The mission of his visitors was promptly explained, and the demand as speedily made for either the sum named in the mortgage deed or the possession of the ship. The money was not forthcoming because it was not there, and the visitors were dared to seize the vessel. The reply of Mr. Akerstein was made to his crew to man the windlass. An incident is narrated of an axe being thereafter seized, briefly flourished, and at a word from the chief of the captors sent spinning into the placid waters, its flourish opinioned and made harmless until he promised good behaviour. The capture was complete. The anchor was hove up, sails set, and in 30 hours from the time Mr. Akerstein and his crew left Nelson on the mission of seizing the Black Diamond, it was lying securely at anchor in Nelson Harbour. It is as nice as a little bit of cutting out as we have heard of for some time. In part 3, I will let you know what he does next. He hasn't got a boat anymore, so is he going to obtain another?
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.